Right then, in this video we're going to look at maintenance of behaviour change. This is Applied Psychology BTEC Unit 3 Section C3 and we're looking in this video at physiological methods of improving adherence. In other words, physical ways that we can make people take their medication and follow medical advice. So, three main sections we want to look at. Firstly, we can give people tests. Such as blood tests or urine tests, or looking at their blood pressure or measuring their weight. And the idea behind that is it's almost like a psychological thing rather than a physical thing. You're doing a physiological measurement, but the reason behind it is that people know they'll be tested and therefore they stick to the treatment. Because what the tests will show is whether or not they've been taking the medication. So for example, they might be measuring the level of a hormone in their urine or the level of part of the medication that's showing up in their urine. Because it's kind of like when you take an assessment or a mock exam, you know that you're going to have a test and therefore you revise. It's the same principle. If you know you're going to have a physical test that shows whether you've been taking your medication, it's like an added incentive to take your medication, isn't it? So really, you're not actually doing anything physical to people, are you really, by doing that, other than like taking the blood and checking it? What you're doing really is just checking that they're taking their medication. So here's two things that you can do physically to help people take their medication. One thing is, if you remember, we talked about side effects being like a barrier or a cost that stops people from taking their medication. Well, one thing we can do is manage side effects in people. And one way you can do that is by giving them further medication. So for example, if someone's taking a medication for a condition that's causing them to then have constipation, and so they stop taking their medication, what you could do is give them a further treatment to clear up their constipation. And so what that then does, hopefully, removes the constipation, so they're okay to keep taking their treatment. The issue with this way of doing it is that medication that you use to clear up the constipation may then have side effects. So you could end up with a sort of endless chain. Then you give another medication to clear those side effects, and it could go on endlessly. So that's not a perfect way of doing it. Let's look at another way. Another way is to look at antidepressants. So many people with a long-term health conditions such as diabetes, not all but many, also suffer from depression. And many disorders also are comorbid with depression. That just means where two disorders exist at the same time. And what you can do, because depression can have an effect on people taking their medication for other ailments, because people perhaps don't look after themselves as well, they don't have energy, it perhaps stops their memory from working as well as it might. So one thing you can do is reduce their depression, and then they're more likely to look after themselves better and manage to take and follow the medical advice about their other long-term condition. So that's one way that's been tried out as being a potential way of improving adherence to help people stick to their course of medicine. Right, let's look at some evaluation of these methods, which we've talked a little bit about already. Firstly, it's really good because we've got practical applications. You'll see this is a recurring theme, isn't it, within this part of the spec. Actually, if doctors can use these ways to help people to stick to their medication, then that's improving their health, it's improving people's lives in a very real way. So that's really good, practical applications. And then there's two research support studies that we know about. The first one is Lustman, which is a key study, and Lustman found that treating depression improved adherence in diabetic patients. So we'll talk about that in a separate video. Markowitz reviewed 8 studies into this topic and found that when they prescribed, when people had tested prescription of antidepressants as a way to improve adherence, that it was the case in the studies that they reviewed. So various different antidepressants had been used: fluoxetine, sertraline, bupropion. You might recognise we talked about that in treatments for addiction. And so that supports the idea that if you treat depression that coexists with a long-term ailment, that actually the adherence to the medication can improve. Right, issues then. They're not as effective as psychological methods of adherence. That's one problem. And that's something you can always do in psychology, is weigh different treatments up against each other, or weigh different explanations up against each other, say this alternative might be better. They're also a short-term treatment. Are we going to make people take 2 different medications forevermore? You know, at what point do you stop giving physical treatments? You know, and when you stop, does that mean that the problem just reoccurs? So that's another problem. And the last problem we've already talked about, really, taking a drug can cause side effects. So we're going to look at Lustman in a separate video in a moment.